Factsverse presents 16 Most Painful Medieval Torture Techniques Ever. Number 1. The Spanish Donkey. The Spanish donkey is also known as the wooden horse. It was used during the Spanish Inquisition. This medieval torture was designed to force a person's body into two halves. A triangular piece of wood was built over horse leg-like support poles. The person being tortured would straddle the wooden device with their hands tied behind their back while naked. Also, weights would be tied on both of the person's ankles to force them down onto the wooden structure, forcing them into two halves. When the victim's body was sliced by the wedge, they would be let down. If they were not dead by the time they were taken off the wood, they would die shortly thereafter. Number 2. Strappado. The strappado was also known as the reverse hanging and the Palestinian hanging. It is unsure where it got this name, as this form of torture was never used by the Palestinian Authority. This is a medieval torture that was designed to induce great pain on the victim. The victim's hands are tied behind their back, and the rope is attached to a pulley system overhead. When the victim is lifted off the ground, the victim's arms will come out of their sockets, which is extremely painful. To increase the victim's pains, the pulley is often jerked and weights are added. This form of torture was most commonly used during medieval inquisitions. Number 3. Saws. Saws were a very common tool in medieval times. One of the most common medieval tortures had the victim tied up to a large wooden structure by their feet, naked. A large saw is used, held by two people at each end. The victim is sliced between their legs. Because they are hanging upside down and the blood is flowing to their head, they remain conscious for quite a while, usually right up until the saw reaches the midsection. This can take quite a while, and it is very painful until the victim finally loses consciousness. Number 4. Elizabeth Bathory, Iron Maiden. This was one of the most common forms of torture during medieval times. The victim would be led into the coffin while they are conscious and aware. Once inside, the door would be closed, which would make it impossible for the victim to move around. If they did, the steel spikes inside would impale them from every direction. During the torture, the interrogator would scream questions to the victim while they were being stabbed. If the victim gives the right answers, they could be allowed out of the coffin, often with serious injuries. If they don't, eventually the pain would be too severe and the patient would pass out. This could take a while. If the pain doesn't cause the victim to lose consciousness, the loss of blood would. Number 5. Stove torture. This is one of the worst of all the medieval tortures. The victim would be chained around a stovepipe. They would sit on top and have their arms and legs wrapped around the stovepipe. The stove would be lit, and the victim would be left there to burn. Wood would continue to be added so that the fire would stay lit until the victim died. Number 6. Garrote torture. This medieval torture consists of a large metal vise. The victim would be seated on a platform on the vise. They would be leaned back until their neck fit into an open vise. The torturer would use a bar that resembles a crowbar, and they would turn the vise slowly until it crushed the victim's neck. It wouldn't take long for the victim to die from asphyxia. Number 7. Heretic's fork. This form of torture included a very sharp double-sided fork. A collar would be placed around the victim's neck, which has a metal ring in the middle right at the throat. The fork would be placed in the metal ring and would be pushed under the chin, and the opposite side would be pushed under the sternum. The victim would then be hung from the ceiling. When their head would drop, it would pierce the victim's throat and chest. Eventually, the fork would go too deep into the neck and sternum, and the victim would die a very painful death. Number 8. The wheel. The wheel, very common in medieval tortures. The victim would be placed on a very large wheel on their back. Their hands and feet would be tied to the wheel. Oftentimes, there would be spikes on the wheel to increase the victim's pain. A fire would be lit under the wheel and large spikes would be sticking out of the wall. The torturers would spin the wheel so that the victim would be burned when the wheel spun around the bottom, and they would be cut when the wheels would spin them by the wall. This would continue until the victim either burned to death or bled to death. Number 9. The breast ripper. The breast ripper is also known as the iron spider or just the spider. This was a common form of torture for a woman who was thought to be a witch. It was also used for women who committed adultery, blasphemy, or self-abortion. Any sinful actions could put a woman in line for this form of torture. When the torture is performed, a sharp metal instrument would be put on the victim's breast. Oftentimes, the torture instrument would be heated up to inflict even more pain. It would then completely rip the woman's breast off of her body. In most cases, the woman would die due to blood loss. If not, infection and sepsis would usually kill her shortly after. This tool was commonly used in the Free State of Bavaria, which is a state in Germany. It was most popular in this area in 1599. It was also used in other parts of Germany and in France right up until the 19th century. Number 10. The tub. This is one of the most painful medieval torture techniques ever. The victim would be placed in a wooden tub and tied down. Their face would be painted with honey and milk. This would cause flies to start to devour the victim's body. Over time, maggots and worms would continue to devour the victim's body as it decayed while they are still alive. It is a horrible and painful form of torture. Number 11. The Brazen Bull. The Brazen Bull was also known as the Sicilian Bull. It was designed in ancient Greece and was a very popular form of torture. The device was made of solid brass with a metal door that can be opened and latched. The victim would be placed inside of the device, and a fire would be set underneath it. The metal would turn yellow on the outside due to the heat. The victim would be cooked to death as if they were placed in an oven. The bull was designed so that the screams of the victim would be amplified, making it sound like the bellowing of a bull. Number 12. The neck torture. This is a form of torture that was not used to kill the victim. It was just used to make them as uncomfortable as possible. The victim would be hooked into a device that is either made of wood or metal. It would be adjusted so that it would be impossible for a person to adjust to a comfortable position. Number 13. The Judas Cradle. This is a form of medieval torture that lasts for a very long time. The victim would be placed over a pyramid-shaped seat and held up by a waist harness. The pointed part of the device would be inserted into the victim's vagina or anus. As the victim is slowly lowered by ropes, the intense pressure would stretch out the orifice. Over time, there would be significant tears in the muscle tissue. Eventually, the victim would be impaled. If not, the victim would die from the septic infection caused by the muscle tears. Number 14. The Chair of Torture. The chair of torture was used in torture chambers and dungeons in the Middle Ages. In Europe, the chair was used until the 1800s. The chair itself can put fear into anyone. It is a metal chair that is layered with 500 to 1,500 spikes. The chair also has straps to restrain the victim. When the victim is placed in the chair, they would be impaled by the spikes. Because the chair is made of iron, a fire can be lit under the chair to burn the victim as well. This form of torture was commonly used to get a confession out of a person while they watched another person being tortured with the device. It was a very common method of getting a person to confess. Number 15. The Coffin Torture. This form of medieval torture involves the victim being hung in a metal cage high above the ground. The cage is only large enough for the victim to barely fit inside. They would be held in the cage and left for crows to feed upon. Eventually, the crows would eat the victims to death. Number 16. The Rack. This is a torture device that consists of a wooden frame that is raised off the ground slightly. It also has a roller at both ends. The victim's ankles would be fastened to one of the rollers and their wrists would be chained to the other. Handles would be attached to the ratchet mechanism and the torturers would turn the rollers, stretching the body out. The victim's joints would become dislocated and then separated. Over time, the muscles would be stretched too far and they would no longer be effective. As the victim lied on the rack and they were stretched, they would hear the gruesome sounds of their own ligaments, cartilage, and bones popping and breaking. Subscribe for more.